and we are joined now by Chloe Maxman, Maine State Senator, and political strategist Canyon Woodward, both of whom are the authors of Dirt Road Revival, How to Rebuild Rural Politics and Why Our Future Depends on It. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Yeah, of course. So, so Chloe, you were elected to the state Senate in Maine. You have a history of climate activism, which we began the show talking a bit about the devastation in Southwest Florida and how Hurricane Ian is more acutely felt given the effects of climate change. But talk a bit about your run for Maine State Senate and how you were able to get elected, because those experiences are really the backbone of your book here.
Yes, I grew up in a small town in rural Maine, and in 2018 I ran for the state house, and in 2020 I ran for the state Senate, and both times Canyon was the brilliant campaign manager. We ran in districts that traditionally have been really tricky for Democrats to win, more rural and conservative districts, and our work has really been about how do we connect with folks who are different than us, and how do we really fight for progressive values in rural communities that are becoming more and more conservative.
And Canyon, what was, some of your background that brought you to working on a Maine State Senate campaign, and what made that unique in terms of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I also come from a very small town, western tip of North Carolina, conservative area, and got into organizing actually with Chloe in college. She founded the fossil fuel divestment movement at Harvard, and so we co-coordinated that, and so our background very much in the climate sphere, and but after years of organizing in that space, I think it was becoming super clear to us that the reason we weren't making the progress we needed legislatively was because of the people that we have in office, and the lack of folks really willing to go to bat on these issues, and so that's what led me to work on the Bernie campaign, both of us, and then for us to dive into the state level politics in Maine.
Well, so Chloe, you got elected, but correct me if I'm wrong, you did not shoot a gun in your political ad. I've been told, or what I see from Democratic strategists, is that is a prerequisite for being a Democrat running in a rural area. I mean, I'm joking here a bit, but I guess just take us to how you ran, essentially, because you described your book as a tough love letter to the Democratic Party, but you ran on climate activism and a variety of other leftist planks without pandering to what I would say certain strategists think are caricatures of a rural voter.
Yeah, I think you framed that really well. Both Canyon and I are progressive people, and we grew up in these rural conservative. We have both of those identities, and I think we see so much how just the messaging and the strategy on the left just hasn't always landed well in rural communities. I think most people mean well, and certainly there are so many Democrats on the ground who are fighting the good fight and are representing and are in office, and I think we found similar themes as so many other people, which is that a lot of rural folks really feel alienated by the Democratic Party. And sometimes the Democrats just don't take the time to go talk to folks who are different, who are Republicans that have never been contacted by Democrats before. And so that's what we went and did. And I think, some might think, oh, we had tricky conversations and no one voted for us, but we found the exact opposite, which is we had incredible conversations with people where we were starting to bridge these huge divides that are erupting in our society right now. And that work just became really, really important to us.
Yeah, you tell a story in your book about a man who you spoke with, and Medicaid expansion came up. And when you indicated your support for Medicaid expansion, he basically wanted you to screw off, but you continued that conversation. How can you describe that part of your book for us, and that interaction, I should say?
that was definitely one of the more life-changing conversations that I had with someone. I'm honest to a fault sometimes. And so when he asked me if I believed in Medicaid expansion, I said yes, and he clearly disagreed. But I was just so taken aback at how things went south in 30 seconds that I asked him if he'd be willing just to take the time to talk with me about his position, even if he didn't end up voting for me. And, he told me this really moving story about his life. And, while I do believe in Medicaid expansion, I had a lot of respect for his story. And I would have never gotten to hear that if my initial reaction had been, okay, we have something really big that does not unite us, and so this conversation is over. That the power of listening and respecting what you hear and wanting to hear stories that are different from yours can go such a long way.
And Canyon, I mean, so much of what was central to your campaigns, both of your campaigns, focus was just door knocking. And I know that, covering the Bernie campaign from a national perspective, or other leftist campaigns like the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaign, which I covered here in New York, that was so central to how there was success. And I mean, how much of that was incredibly deliberate on your part? And would it even be more important in rural communities where there's such a kind of aversion to the Democratic Party that has probably ballooned based on honestly hard data over the past decade or so, or 2 decades too?
Yeah, I mean, we go back just as recently as 2009, the partisan split in rural America was dead even. So it's not that long ago. And now it's a 16-point Republican advantage. And yeah, the door knocking is central. That's, the movement spheres where Chloe and I came from, and running a grassroots campaign that was really focused on going door to door and organizing volunteer teams and just going out and saying, hey, what's on your mind, as opposed to showing up with a clipboard and, a script of here are our points on education and healthcare, et cetera. I think there's a really, really bad tendency in the Democratic Party, as you alluded to be like, oh, unless you're Joe Manchin, you're not going to have a snowball's chance in hell of winning a rural district with a 16-point Republican advantage like Chloe was running in 2018. But the reality is, if you're willing to go and show up and listen to folks and build relationships and rebuild trust, folks are willing to vote for a Democrat. And I think that was proof to us that those dogmas within the Democratic Party need to be challenged, and that we can still run and win in rural America.
So once you did get elected, Chloe, I know that one of your priorities was a rural Green New Deal. How did you sell that to voters? And I know it got cut into a little bit based on, in the negotiation process, but you were still able to pass this. I feel like a lot of the national conversation around Green New Deal or climate justice politics are, these are just like East Coast liberals who want solar panels up the wazoo, but you were able to tailor it to your community.
Yeah, my first time running in 2018, I rarely heard folks mention the words climate change, and I really wanted the policy that I worked on to reflect and represent my community. But I did hear people talk about, the droughts in the summer make farming really hard, or I can't go ice fishing in the winter like I used to. These ways that we're talking about climate impacts in a rural community. So I decided to sponsor an act to establish a Green New Deal for Maine to really draw attention to a different way of talking about climate change that's really rooted in a rural working class setting. We partnered with the unions. It was the first state Green New Deal bill to be endorsed by a state AFL-CIO affiliate. And that partnership was so inspirational to me, and just following the lead of the unions and their expertise and experience on the ground. It's just so important that the ways that we talk about climate change are really meant for the folks who we're talking to. There's not a uniform way to talk about this issue, and the policies for rural Maine and rural America are going to look really different for what suburban or urban places need. So I think, for me, it was just a way of talking about this issue in a way that really represented my community.
And I'll say, too, I think, this conversation is not, there's a characterization of the rural voter as basically a white person, but a big part of how the Democrats were able to flip Georgia in these latest two elections was turning out a lot of rural black voters in the state. And so a lot of this is just going to areas of the country and of states where Democrats need to make gains and actually campaigning there, because there's been mass divestment in rural areas in general by the National Democratic Party. Canyon, do you mind speaking to how that started to happen?
Gosh, I mean, I don't feel like I have the full inside look on that. I wish I knew, but I think you're totally right. Talking about Georgia, looking at Arizona, and what a huge role the indigenous vote had in flipping Arizona, the Navajo Nation, and I think what Beto is doing in Texas is awesome, going out to every county there and organizing the Latino vote, and I think, from the Democratic Party standpoint, it's just, I don't know how it started, but it definitely became ingrained of just like this idea that rural voters are ignorant, stupid, and voting against their own interests, and we're not even going to bother with trying to win them over. Instead, we're going to try and squeeze every vote we can out of, Democratic strongholds. And you see that all across the party in the past decade. We had the chair of the DNC in 2018 say you can't knock doors in rural America, which he apologized for, but it was just really revealing of what the party mindset is towards rural America. And what we saw is you absolutely can and have to knock doors in rural America. That's what we should be leaning into really, really hard.
So can you talk about what's happened a bit more broadly over the past 2 decades, the massive amounts of loss in terms of rural county wins? Either of you can take this one, because Bill Clinton, he was a lot more successful with rural counties. And then there was a big drop off with Obama, but Obama was a lot more successful with rural counties than Joe Biden, who there was a precipitous drop off there too, which, again, speaks to something structural, clearly, in my opinion, as opposed to candidate based.
Yeah, there's, part of what we dug into in the book is all of the many factors that have really contributed to Democrats losing a foothold in rural America. And I don't think that there's one single thing that we can point to. I think, in general, the Democrats have like a more of a turnout focus on state level races. And so if you're trying to win a state level race like governor, for example, and you need your Democrats to vote, you're really going to focus on the cities where all the Democrats, for a variety of reasons, have congregated. And that kind of leaves out all of the rural Democrats and all of the rural races from the calculus. And so as that has happened over the last many years, what we've seen is that Republican rural areas have just trended more and more to the right. The consequences of that are manyfold. We're seeing them now as it impacts the presidency in many state level races in states where traditionally it's been a little bit more blue, but we're also seeing state legislatures as a whole tilt to the right. Democrats lost almost 1,000 state legislative seats during Obama's presidency, and that's a huge thing. So in this day and age, when so much of the fight to protect our basic human rights are falling to state legislatures, it's more important than ever that we don't just focus on turning votes out in the city, but really going and supporting all of those amazing people who are pounding the pavement or pounding the dirt roads in their rural communities.
I mean, and to be completely cold-blooded about it too, rural voters have more power with their vote than other voters do due to the Electoral College and the way that our Senate is constructed. So it's it from a national Democratic perspective, in terms of like just more Democratic seats, that also seems to be a smart strategy. And yet, this rural, I mean, you wrote about this, I'm not sure which one of your sections this was in, but the rural divestment really began in 2009. And these were due to decisions like, Nancy Pelosi getting rid of the rural working group, and Harry Reid not making a conscious choice for the Senate candidates to be a bit more focused elsewhere, right? Can you talk about what happened in advance of the 2010 midterms and what sustained from that?
Yeah, I think there's been a really active shifting away, again, back to the kind of failed calculus of thinking that demographic shifts were gonna hit a tipping point where the cities and increasing the suburbs could carry Democrats to victory in a way that really has not panned out over the past decade. And I think that it's a problem that the leadership of the party just stays in place year after year, with kind of the inertia of the same perspectives and the same sort of DC Beltway consultants that keep pushing these same failed strategies, even though we see how much they set us back cycle after cycle. And I think until we are willing to buck some of this consultant establishment and mindset and demand more from our leadership, it's going to be hard to fully turn things around.
And Chloe, I'm curious about your perspective on Sarah Gideon's loss to Susan Collins, because she was not the more progressive candidate in the Democratic primary, but the real what was spoken about in her favor was that she had deep pockets, and she was able to fundraise against Susan Collins, and the poll numbers going into that race had her up. And so people thought this was maybe the safest possible flip, and it did not happen or come close to happening, honestly. So from your perspective in the state Senate, and as someone who has run a race in that state, what did you see as the failures and maybe what the national press missed on that particular race?
Yeah, Sarah was the Speaker of the House during my first term in the legislature, and I think she's an amazing woman and an amazing leader, and I have a lot of respect for her. I think the campaign was just kind of flawed in some of the same ways that we're talking about here, which is just very deriving a lot of its strategy and its input from urban spaces and spaces that are outside of Maine. One of the things about Maine is that Mainers are very protective and prideful of our Maine identity. And so people could sense that and would read about all of the outside money flowing into Maine. And it really just contributed to the existing stereotypes of Democrats. Susan Collins is from rural Maine, and she's always had a very strong rural vote. And the Gideon campaign just didn't get out into rural communities, and to all of the Republicans and independents who have historically voted for Susan Collins. There was some really great analysis after her loss that that really dug into this, but I think it's a good example of the trends that we're talking about. And I think we all know how important it was for Democrats to defeat Susan Collins, and so again, just reiterating the importance of why we need to focus on rural voters so that we can win these critical seats.
Right. I mean, and I just hope that we learn a lesson from it, because as confident as we may be, and I'm way more confident, frankly, in the quality of the campaign that someone like John Fetterman is running, but we had some similar feelings about just at least the raw numbers going into 2020 and how Susan Collins could actually lose. And I'm just hopeful that there's some lessons learned about even if you have this polling lead advantage, that the strategy matches it. And it seems like Fetterman's been able to do that. But for other candidates throughout the country, I'm hopeful about that. With that said, though, I think we're going to wrap up here. Chloe Maxman Maine State Senator, and strategist Canyon Woodward, who worked on her campaign for State Senate. The book is called Dirt Road Revival: How to Rebuild Rural Politics and Why Our Future Depends on It. Thank you both so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Emma.